Acetals, hemiacetals, ketals, and hemiketals are a series of structurally related molecules that all have two things in common. One is that they have a carbon that has two oxygens attached, and the other is that they're formed from carbonyls. Now, if we picture carbon-oxygen double bond and an alcohol, and we imagine doing a nucleophilic acyl addition followed by a proton shuffle. So we just move that hydrogen from the alcohol over to that originally attached to the carbonyl oxygen. Then we've got essentially an alpha, not even an alpha hydroxy ether. We have an ether and an alcohol sharing the same carbon. We take that a step further, which is typically the case, then we can have two ether groups on that same oxygen. And that will be an acetal if we started from an aldehyde. So acetals and hemiacetals are from an aldehyde plus an alcohol. If we used a ketone, then we have a ketal when we have that geminal diether, geminal for twins, like the two oxygens sharing the same carbon. Now the hemi for ketal or acetal comes from when we have the halfway point. So we have one ether and one alcohol group. Hemiacetal comes from an aldehyde. Hemiketal comes from a ketone. And there are a number of things that we do with these, and a number of reasons they're important. The hemiacetals, we don't normally stop here when we're doing organic chemistry or lab chemistry. So under the conditions that form a hemiacetal or a hemiketal, you're typically going to go on to the full-on acetal or ketal. These, however, the hemis, particularly acetal, hemiacetals, but also hemiketals, are structurally important for biochemistry. So most sugars exist in a cyclic form, where we have a ring, and we'll just take this generic sugar here, where we have a bunch of OH groups, and you'll notice that there is one of those alcohols that is not actually an alcohol group, but an acetal. See if you can find it. This one is a primary alcohol. These three are secondary alcohols. This last OH and the ether are part of a hemiacetal. We say hemi because there's one OH, and we say acetal because there's a hydrogen on that former carbonyl carbon that was an aldehyde. So the hemiacetals and hemiketals will be especially important in biochemistry as structural features in carbohydrates. In organic chemistry, we tend to focus more on the acetals and the ketals, and then their use as so-called protecting groups. Before we go there, however, let's take a look at a few different structures and see if you can identify them as an acetal, a ketal, a hemiacetal, or a hemiketal. So we're going to identify them by their type of structure. So two things that we want to consider here. One is going to be, if we look at each individual structure, we want to find the carbonyl carbon, or the carbon that actually has two oxygens attached, and see we've got two oxygens. That means we have two other bonds, in this case a carbon and a hydrogen. If we have that hydrogen present, that's going to identify it as a acetal or a hemiacetal. In this particular case, notice we have two ethers, so we have an acetal. In this molecule, by contrast, we have carbons on both sides, so we're looking at a ketal or a hemiketal. Our oxygens both have carbons attached to them, and so we're looking at a ketal. This one in particular is cyclic. The two alcohol groups are actually attached together, and so it looks sort of like an alien baby head. Give it some eyes and some teeth or something. But that's a convenience in the sense that that one molecule provided both OHs, but it doesn't really affect the reaction, other than it makes it a little easier to make happen. And we'll look at that when we talk about the actual reaction mechanisms, which will be a separate video. In this example, here's our carbonyl carbon. We identify it as such because it's the one that has the two O's attached. We have two carbons attached to it, so we're looking at a ketal or hemiketal. Because of the alcohol group, this one would be a hemiketal. This one is another acetal.